sent me? Oh, I emailed you a link. You should click that link.
How many people are on this bad boy?
So far, we got 109, 113.
113. Wow. Okay, so join as guest.
What?
Join as guest.
Yeah. You guys ready? I was saying that to the people that can hear me. They can't hear you. They can hear me.
All right.
Did you click it?
Join call.
Yeah.
I think it's happening.
I think it might be too. I'm not sure.
I'm on headphones because I'm a professional, mature live streamer who knows.
If you don't mind, for our guests.
Okay, here we go. Headphones are on. Oh, I even have a better microphone that I could have used. I could run and get it. Do you think that's worth doing?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, you say yes, it is worth doing?
Sure, I can talk to our esteemed viewers here as you shuffle through your basement to find a mic. No problem.
1 minute.
All right. Guys will be on in probably no time at all. Thank you so much for attending the Bicycle Day talk we had planned at 6 p.m. I hope you have done enough psychedelics to have a verdant oasis of the virtue known as patience in your body as we wait here. You're welcome, Eliane G. Thank you for being so kind. If people feel like showering me or Hamilton with compliments in the chat, you can do that. That's my biggest fan, Clara. I've had to block her on Instagram, but it looks like she's here. So good to see you, Clara. All right, you're back? All right, cool.
And I'm putting it.
This is for Clara. Happy Bicycle Day, Tokyo.
I think this is a better situation. Maybe not.
Probably.
Right, here we go.
Is it plugged in now?
It's plugged in, but maybe it's not
Holy
selected.
Shit, you're gonna sound way better than me, man. I don't know if we want that. I think people came here for my. Okay, you want to test it again?
Does that sound any better? Is this even? Does it seem as if this is a?
Can you get closer?
Hello.
Closer.
Hello.
There
hello.
it is.
Okay.
Yeah. Hamilton. Happy Bicycle Day.
Happy Bicycle Day too. This is not something that I normally celebrate.
Well, did you have trouble sleeping last night at all?
No, I slept very well.
Even though it was Bicycle Day today?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome. Happy Bicycle Day to everyone else joining us for this second live talk with our friend Hamilton.
Did you learn anything important about LSD during the previous talk?
During the previous talk, you and I did.
No, you just you had another talk.
Yeah, it was a very different kind of disposition towards acid that was really good. Chris Beisch talked about his religious and spiritual quests that he did through 73 high-dose LSD sessions. I don't know if anyone here, thank you, Duck. Someone named Duck said they loved the last talk. Came to that, but yeah, it was good. Were you busy or something, or?
I didn't have the link. I didn't have the link for the live stream. I've heard about this guy. He seems really interesting.
He is, yeah, really well spoken and just standout guy. He wrote a book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe. When's your book coming out?
I don't know. probably not soon. I had a book deal, but then it was impossible to write the book.
Was it spiritual tips from Hamilton on psychedelics?
It was definitely not that.
Because people are looking. People are looking.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And all right, let's get the first question out of the way. I know it's burning on everyone's minds. What's your favorite Grateful Dead album?
Oh man, I feel like I'm gonna make a lot of enemies if I share my true opinion of the Grateful Dead. I've given the Grateful Dead many chances to be something that I could get into. Mm-hmm. I think I've been very open-minded about liking the Grateful Dead, and anytime someone who's fanatical about the Grateful Dead tells me that I really have to get into it, I'll say, okay, what is the song that is the best Grateful Dead song? And after I listen to it, presumably then I'll understand what is so good about this band. And they'll say, Box of Rain or something, or like Friend of the Devil. And I've listened to those songs, and it seems like just kind of like weird, soft country music that is not especially psychedelic in its lyrics or musical style, as far as I can tell. So it seems as if it's like, it almost feels random to me that this is the band that psychedelic people totally love. And I am, of course, aware of the history of the Grateful Dead and the fact that Owsley did their sound and that there's a huge sort of LSD scene associated with them. But that all aside, just on a musical level, I don't really get it. And then they'll say, oh, you need to listen to this like 15-hour live recording and then you'll get it. But I don't want to listen to a 15-hour live recording to understand this band. And I don't know, maybe one day. I'm still open to it, but it's not... I don't really relate to the lyrics.
Yeah.
Do you?
No, not at all. I'm surprised
you're a friend of the
seriously. Yeah. You do. I've tried to get into it too, and people are like, well, listen to this 7-hour, 48 bit rate recording from 1972, and it should become appallingly clear, but not usually. I have been to a live show, though, not of Grateful Dead, obviously, but of their Michael Meyer, what's his name? The guitarist guy. John Meyer, I think. Yeah, I do think it is kind of an experience. I don't know. You've never been to like a live like jam band show like that, like with Fish or anything?
Like a live jam band?
I have not been to a jam band show before, no.
Well, maybe you and I can do like a live Brooklyn version of something similar one day.
Yeah.
John Mayer, thank you, Dubaguna. All right. So, have you tried acid?
Yes,
okay.
I've tried LSD. Yeah.
When was your first encounter with this substance? Actually, do you want to tell people the story of why we're celebrating?
Sure. Yeah, I can. I imagine most people are already familiar with the story to some extent, and I'll even preface the story by saying everyone calls him Albert Hoffman, but the name is actually pronounced Hofmann. It's really unfortunate. I'm going to call him Albert Hoffman because you can only fight so many of those battles without looking like a huge asshole. I made I think, valiant effort with kratom, and then people get angry at you. I chose the more common pronunciation, methaqualone, and people got angry about that. They wanted me to say methaqualone, but for the record, it's Hofmann. Okay, anyway.
Thank you.
So, I'm going to call him Albert Hoffman. Albert Hoffman was a chemist at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. He was interested in derivatives of lysergic acid. Lysergic acid is a unnatural product of a ergot alkaloid called ergotamine. So if you treat ergotamine with an acid or a base, usually a base, you can produce this stuff called lysergic acid. And lysergic acid is very interesting because it has this kind of wide range of medical uses once it's transformed into various other drugs. So you can transform it into a drug called bromocriptine, and that's a treatment for Parkinson's disease, or ergometrine, and then that's used in obstetrics, or methyl ergometrine, or I mean, there's quite a few that have been studied at various points. So anyway, this is a promising area obstetrically and potentially even in psychiatry and treatment of neurodegenerative diseases. There's a lot of interest in what these things might do. So he wasn't looking for a psychedelic. He had no idea that these compounds could produce a psychedelic, because at that time, the understanding of psychedelics at all was very, very obscure. There was Hefter, who'd done early research with mescaline that predated Albert Hofmann's work with LSD, but for the most part, the average medicinal chemist would have no real awareness of this area. So anyway, he was interested in this nicotinamide derivative that was used as a treatment for barbiturate overdoses. And I actually can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Maybe one of the people in the comment bar or something will jog my memory. But anyway, it had an N and it had a diethylamide substitution pattern. And Albert Hofmann saw that chemical and he thought that it would be an interesting pattern to test on a novel lysergamide. So he made LSD. At some point, I think it was...
Is it nicotinamide?
Yes, it is. Yeah, nicothamide. I think it's. Is that? Well, anyway, so he saw that chemical, which I've always wanted to try as well, and used that same substitution pattern. Made LSD in the late 30s. Didn't try it until the 40s, and it wasn't until 1943 that he actually took it. Initially, it was a very small dose where he had this sort of like threshold effect that he knew was compelling. And then on April 19th, he took a 250 microgram dose of LSD, which is a very high dose, and had the first LSD trip in history. So that's what Bicycle Day is.
High dose by certain standards. Our last guest actually was doing it in the 500 to 600 range, but.
And how did this man know? This is one thing that really, like, not to say, like, people, you constantly talk about micrograms in the psychedelic community. Mm-hmm. They're always saying, oh, I think LSD is best in the 50 microgram to 100 microgram range. Where are they deriving these numbers? They're not weighing it out on a scale. They're just assuming blindly that one blotter is 100 micrograms, which is, if anything, exclusively evidence to the contrary. So, like, I there's something that drives me crazy about false quantification. I hope that this guy was somehow really quantifying the doses, but most people will just make a number. 100 is standard, 200 and something or other it becomes strong, and there's no meaning to any of it. So if anyone listening to this can learn anything, I would say just stop with the fake quantification of your dosages. For the love of science, please stop.
Sounds
because
like you need like a
you're muddy.
Mic dose yourself, Hamilton. That's what I would recommend.
I think 75.4.
How does someone measure in micrograms? What would pass the Hamilton sniff test?
Well, there are scales that are sensitive enough to measure micrograms. That would be the one way of doing it. The most common way would be volumetrically. So if you had 1 milligram of analytically confirmed pure LSD, and even then we can talk about what that even means, pure LSD, because you have different isomers of LSD and you have different salts of LSD depending on what the acid used to, because LSD, another fun fact, people call it acid. LSD is not an acid, it's a base. And so when you react LSD with an acid, you get a salt. Usually it's the fumarate salt, but fumaric acid has 2 acidic sites on the molecule.
Can I ask you, do you think basic people will be salty that acid's not an acid?
I would hope they're excited and delighted by that.
Oh,
do you think
basic yeah, sorry. I'm listening. We're listening. Sorry, guys.
Right.
What were you saying, Hamilton?
Anyway, okay, so the fumaric acid has 2 acidic hydrogens. It can form a stoichiometric salt where there's one acid molecule for each LSD molecule, or it can form a hemisalt where there are two LSD molecules connected to the same acid molecule. Anyway, and that's, of course, all going to change the potency. So you're talking about 1 milligram of LSD or something like that. You first have to know what the stereochemistry of the LSD is. Second, you have to know the purity, and you also have to know, what the stoichiometry of the salt is. So anyway, these are all like things that make this even more complicated and make this false quantification even more obnoxious. But then, so let's assume that you had, 1 milligram of the stoichiometric salt of D-LSD fumarate, and you wanted to have a precise 250 microgram dose to try to replicate Albert Hoffman's bicycle day experience. One way to do that would be to dissolve that known quantity of LSD in a known quantity of a solvent like water, because the LSD salts are water soluble, or you could use an alcohol as well. And then you could use a micropipette or something like that so then you'd have 1 milligram and 1 milliliter. And then if you took 100 microliters from that solution, then you'd have exactly 100 micrograms. Or if you took 250 microliters, you'd have 250 micrograms. That's how volumetric measurement works. So that would be a way to do it. And I hope, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, especially the stoichiometry. Once you got on that, it all became clearer.
It's not. It sounded complicated. It's really not at all. It's like you just make a solution of a known concentration. That's all. Anyway.
What is stoichiometry?
Stoichiometry is like, it's like basically it's just measurement of reagents in a reaction. So when people talk about like a stoichiometric quantity, they're talking about usually 1 mole of one reactant for 1 mole of another reactant, right? And I think the etymology is it comes from stitch. Anyway.
So Albert Hoffman, he got it on his fingers accidentally at first, you said, right?
No one knows exactly how he was exposed with the initial low-dose experience that happened on April 16th, preceding the bicycle day experience. David Nichols, who, for people that don't know who David Nichols is, he's kind of like the foremost living expert on LSD, not historically, but also historically, he's very knowledgeable. He's a chemist and a pharmacologist. He thinks that Albert Hoffman had a spontaneous mystical experience on April 16th, and that because his lab technique was so immaculate that it's unlikely that he would have accidentally dosed himself. But I think the bottom line is that no one really knows, and it has been a source of endless speculation for that reason. Some people find the whole story suspect. Some people think it was a spontaneous mystical experience. Some people think it's happened exactly as he described it in his autobiography, LSD, My Problem Child.
Yeah, I would assume someone of his stature as a chemist would have run in a tight ship in the lab. Is that something that happens often? Like people might get a few micrograms or whatever on their hands?
It depends. I would say that at that time in the early 20th century, in general, the use of personal protective equipment didn't exist in science the way it does now. People didn't wear gloves. Often people did chemistry without the use of a fume hood. And the exposure to chemicals was relatively commonplace, especially solvents. On the other hand, Albert Hoffman would have been acutely aware of the fact that much of the history of ergot is associated with ergot poisoning. And ergot poisoning is pretty frightening. I mean, there are different types. There's convulsive ergotism and gangrenous ergotism, and neither of them are desirable. You can lose limbs. You can obviously have profound psychological disturbances. You can even die, I think. In fact, I'm pretty sure that you can die. So, of course you can die. So, although I think loss of limbs is a bit more common than actual death,
is that what
but it really
gangrenous poisoning means?
Yeah, gangrenous ergotism, and so he would have been aware of all of that, and I imagine that he was very cautious around these compounds, knowing that they had the potential to exert that type of effect.
So a leading scientist in the UK advocates for the theory that it was a spontaneous mystical experience that led him to LSD 25, reinvestigating it.
Who's this leading scientist?
David Nichols, right?
Oh no, David Nichols is American.
Oh, whoops. I think I was confusing him with somebody else. But that's the position he advocates for, that it's...
That is his position.
Cool.
What's
your position?
My position is to just assume that Albert Hoffman was telling the truth in his own description of events, because that seems like the most likely scenario to me.
Yeah, or maybe he was like looking back and trying to describe it and came up with the physical explanation. Someone asked what you're drinking, if you don't mind, a quick tangent.
This is just like a nutritious smoothie that contains banana, walnuts, almonds, chia seeds, flax seeds, spinach,
and some ayahuasca.
Blueberries.
Yeah, nice.
Absolutely not.
That sounds good. You made that?
Yeah, I made it.
I think I am thinking of David Nutt, Aiden. Thank you. Thank you for saving my face there. David Nutt is in the UK, not David Nichols. So, okay, there's another drink you have there. Don't want to ask.
Tea.
Tea, cool. What else you got? So he took this bike ride and then went home, and then any other insights that you can tell us from there that happened, or?
Yeah, I mean, the story has been told and retold endless times, and I actually have always been a little bit less interested in Hoffman, because I feel that there's already he's fetishized so much by the psychedelic community that I always felt like just far more interested in Alexander Shulgin. So anyway, so I've never, I've read his autobiography, I've talked to people that knew him, but I've never, really. But yes, you characterize the story. He rides home on his bicycle. Sorry, I didn't mean to just be like a naysayer. He rides home on his bicycle. He calls his physician, and then he recovers and has the first psychedelic experience. And he later gives it to his colleagues. And within 25 years, LSD, in 23 years, almost to the day from that experience, Sandoz is forced to discontinue the production of pharmaceutical LSD. And I believe 3 years later, it's illegal across the United States and soon the world. So it was a really fast trajectory. I mean, a substance as dramatic as LSD doesn't take a long time for it to get around. It went at a time, obviously, before the internet and before any kind of high-speed dissemination of information. It really, really rapidly fascinated the scientific community. And when people think about LSD and psychedelia, they often think about the 1960s or the 1970s, which is when things really became part of culture. But they often neglect the 1950s, which is when an enormous amount of this early scientific research on LSD was being conducted. So it wasn't long. I mean, it really, after that experience, LSD gains momentum. Sandoz is behind it. They see this as a potentially profitable endeavor. And what I think is really cool is, they keep going with it. So Albert Hoffman then, collaborates with R. Gordon Wasson. He goes to Huautla de Jimenez. He collects samples of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. He then isolates and characterizes the structure and develops a synthesis for psilocybin and psilocin, as well as the diethyl derivatives of psilocybin and psilocin, because I think he was so impacted by the profundity of this diethyl substituent on LSD that he wanted to see if it would have a similar effect on the tryptamine psychedelics, because the dimethyl of LSD, I believe it is active, but it's way down in potency, whereas the diethyl is like almost optimal. Even better is the dimethylazetidine substitution. But anyway, so he does the same thing with the tryptamines. He even does some preliminary work on salvia. And this was all really supported by Sandoz, which is totally fascinating. And and it even resulted, I think, indirectly in the production of some just normal non-psychoactive pharmaceuticals like Pindolol, which is structurally derived from 4-hydroxyindole, which is the basis of psilocin. So there's a lot of like really, really cool stuff that came out of this, and yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm getting some hate on the comments, but I'm gonna keep going.
What is the hate?
Someone said, "Does this host read anything scientific about LSD? What's the point of being a part?" Yeah, I don't actually read too much science on LSD. And we have Hamilton here to give us his take, who can describe it much more eloquently than I. So you mentioned that you think the psychedelic community pays a lot of attention on Albert, but there's other lesser-known people. One you mentioned is Alexander Shulgin, who we know from PCAL and TCAL, and you're obviously one of his spiritual followers. So what did he have to do with LSD that maybe people aren't as familiar with?
Very little, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, as far as I know, he had nothing to do with LSD. So if you read the book TCAL, there is a section in TCAL dedicated to lysergamides, which features some of the first published characterizations of the qualitative effects of then novel lysergamides such as ethlad, prolad, alilad, and so on. And I had always wondered, where did these reports come from? Because I didn't think that they came from Shulgin, and I do know where they came from. Shulgin did not synthesize them. I don't know that I have permission to tell the full story, but I think it's safe to say that they came more from the Nichols side of things. So Shulgin had very little to do with lysergamides, other than I think the evaluation of some of the novel ones. And in terms of the chemistry, I don't really think he did any of that at all. And why he didn't, I think because every chemist wants to stake their claim on a new territory, and Albert Hofmann had really done extensive investigations of the lysergamides, and Shulgin at that time was Mr. Phenethylamine, and that's what he did. So and I didn't mean to be a hater. Maybe I'm a little bit down on Albert Hofmann because of these these like sort of unsavory rumors that have been circulating.
Unsavory rumors. What? I don't know if you want to contribute to their circulation, but I haven't even heard of any of these.
No. Well, I don't. Should I?
Don't worry.
Well,
do you think it'll add to the discussion, or?
Well, I mean, okay, I'll say it because it's public. It's public information, but and maybe I'm wrong, or well, anyway. There's this psychedelic scholar named Robert Fort, who's the editor of an anthology called Entheogens and the Future of Religion. He was friends with Albert Hofmann, and I believe may have even lived with him in Switzerland for a period. I mean, they did know each other. And I was talking to him on the phone a little while ago, and he was saying, like the Albert Hofmann that I knew was very different from the Albert Hofmann the world knew. And I was like, yes, I can imagine. We all have these very reductive ideas about these public figures. Mm-hmm. We think of them as the guy that made LSD, the guy that made psilocybin. But of course, he was a deeper person with deeper characteristics. And I'm sure that there was a lot more to him than that. And he said, yeah, when you really got to know Albert Hofmann as a man and really spent time with him in his home, that you learned that he actually really hated Jews.
Okay. That's a bummer. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Happy Bicycle Day. Honoring our hero. Darn it. Was that just from that one?
I don't know. I mean, he's posted this publicly. I mean, this is a thing that he has made this claim that I don't know. So is that fair? I hope it's not true, but it's a circulating thing. Anyway, you know what? If he was not into Jews, then that's unfortunate. But he still made some great contributions to chemistry.
Yeah, let's stick to the good vibes only here.
How are the commenters responding to that? Are they in favor? his dislike of Jews, or are they
Let's see.
on the fence about it?
I'm seeing LOL. Didn't expect that. Someone did a bunch of O's. It is disappointing. Someone asked if you have any stories about Uncle Fester and LSD that you could share.
Yeah, I have a story about Uncle Fester. And
Who
LSD.
is Uncle Fester? Sorry, I
Uncle?
haven't done enough research on Uncle Fester.
Uncle Fester is a hilarious, charming, slightly insane author of extremist texts on home manufacture of explosives, manufacture of armor-piercing bullets, knife fighting techniques, and the manufacture of nerve agents. One of his books on the manufacture of nerve agents was actually found in the library of the Shinrikyo cult that synthesized sarin to bomb the Tokyo subway system in the 90s. So he's a truly infamous guy, and he wrote a book about the synthesis of LSD. And I spent about a week with Uncle Fester this winter, and I mean, he makes no secret of the fact that he has never done a lick of lysergamide chemistry. That book is just purely either speculative or based on his own analysis of scientific literature and patent literature. So he has never done any kind of LSD-related work. And that is true of a lot of Uncle Fester's work. He's a very interesting character, but in terms of his practical experience with synthesis, it is quite limited. Yeah.
Speaking of synthesis, could you walk us through like a layman's step by step of how you make LSD?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I can talk generally about the chemistry. Sure. So one of the things that people. Okay, so you start with ergot, because the total synthesis of lysergic acid is incredibly challenging. I mean, if you look at the history of it, it's a fascinating history. I recommend any chemistry students listening to this discussion to check it out. Often the synthesis is actually credited to Woodward, who's a brilliant chemist that many people, myself included, really admire. But it was Kornfeld who was mostly responsible for the total synthesis, and it's really hard. I mean, there's like a great video by this British chemist named Fenderson 666 or 555 or whatever, where he goes into breaks down the total synthesis of lysergic acid, and it involves some very bizarre and dangerous things like using hydrogen cyanide as a solvent. So anyway, that's very challenging. So the easier thing to do is to let the enzymes in a fungus do all of the hard labor for you. And then from a sclerotium, you can extract the alkaloids, and you can hydrolyze the alkaloid mixture, and the ergotamine will be converted to lysergic acid. The lysergic acid is really almost the entirety of the LSD molecule. You have a carboxylic acid, and then you just have to make an amide bond. And there are, I won't say infinite, but there are a lot of different very approachable ways to make an amide from a carboxylic acid. Some of them involve multiple steps. So if you were to produce the acid chloride or an anhydride, those are two ways that it was done historically with phosphorus oxychloride, where you could use acetic anhydride to produce these two reactive intermediates that are then reacted with diethylamine to produce LSD, but you could also use more modern techniques that involve peptide coupling reagents like PIBOP. So that's basically how it's done. And then you have a mixture of two different isomers, and you need to you have to remove the iso LSD, and you can do that with chromatography using an alumina column. And there's even like really clever ways of monitoring the relative elution of these two fractions using ultraviolet light, because they fluoresce at different wavelengths, and the LSD has a kind of prominent blue fluorescence.
The blue. How do you notice the blue fluorescence?
It's visible. You can notice it with your eyes.
Have you seen it like that before?
Yes, I have actually. I have, I've seen people shine a ultraviolet light on LSD, and I've seen the blue fluorescence, and it's very, very interesting and very beautiful. And you know, it's so fluorescent that there have even been hypotheses of psychedelic action. I believe one of the early ones was authored by David Nichols, who I keep bringing up. If you're not familiar with David Nichols, I can't recommend this man enough. He's really just his work on LSD is what you need to read if you want to understand it better on a chemical and pharmacological level. But anyway, because LSD was so fluorescent, he hypothesized, along with some other authors, that it might even be the case that there is a correlation between psychedelic potency and intensity of fluorescence. And because there's a number of other very fluorescent psychedelics as well. Actually, a lot of psychedelics are fluorescent. And then I was really interested. I wanted to go, I was in North Dakota last year, and I was going to these wheat fields to observe the growth of ergot, this fungus. And the sclerotium. A sclerotium is a hardened fungal structure. Many species of fungi produce a kind of almost like a tuber, like a hardened wintering structure that can then germinate and sporulate in the spring. So, and the major species of ergot that people study is Claviceps purpurea, and I was interested in finding out, because it's purple, I was interested if it would be fluorescent. And so I went in the middle of the night to these wheat fields in North Dakota with a very, very powerful ultraviolet light that did long wave and short wave UV. And what I was amazed by was that it was totally, totally not fluorescent at all. And I think that's because there are pigments in the cortex of the sclerotium that block ultraviolet light and prevent the fluorescence of the lysergamides.
Is this the plant you posted? Is this the wheat thing?
Yeah.
So what is that wheat plant called, you said?
It's called wheat.
Wheat. I think I've heard of this. Okay.
Wheat. Yeah.
Just regular wheat?
Yeah, regular wheat.
Here's a picture of it for people who don't follow Hamilton on the IGs. What was your first experience with acid, if you don't mind?
First experience with acid. Well, I was always kind of reluctant to use LSD when I was. Oh, let me see here. Okay, how about that? I was sort of reluctant to use LSD because when I first became interested in psychedelics, sometime around 2000, really interested around 2006, it was more difficult to find LSD, and it was also a time when research chemicals were very easily obtained on the internet. And I kind of felt like, and I was very into this sort of ultra careful experimentation where you weigh everything on a scale, and I found, and I wasn't interacting with the black market in any way, not that there's anything wrong with that, I just wasn't. And so I kind of felt like, well, why do I want to use this like black market substance that I don't know the dosage of it? And so I didn't use it for quite a while. And then eventually I was in Australia with a girl that I was dating at the time, and she was friends with this medical student who was also maybe an LSD dealer, or came from some kind of family of LSD dealers or something crazy. It was a very strange situation, and he gave me 3 microdots. And who knows how, I'm not going to say like, I have no idea how much it was. It was a lot. It was a lot of LSD. And that is really the only, I'm very inexperienced with LSD. So I've had this one experience. Could you
just move over to your left a little bit for the camera? Just a smidge. There we go. That's good. Thanks.
Yeah.
So you've never tried LSD? Tried it once.
I've tried it a couple times, but I've only tried it at a high dose one time, and it was at a really high dose, at a totally incapacitatingly.
But do you know what the dose might have been?
I have no idea. It was 3 microdots.
What are microdots? Are
LSD incorporated into a sort of tableting material. It's like an LSD tablet, a very small LSD tablet. So it's, some kind of, maybe it's magnesium stearate or something, I don't know, some kind of, or talc, some stuff. And anyway,
like
I
a
have no idea
pressed pill, sort of.
Yes, it was a very tiny press. I don't even know. By the way, I don't even know that it was LSD. So like, forget dosage. I don't know. I didn't analyze this material. I assume it was LSD. It had all of the characteristics that are associated with LSD, and it came from this guy who seemed very knowledgeable and enthusiastic about LSD. But who knows? It probably was LSD. But who knows what the dose was? And it was very, very, very strange and amazing. So that was kind of,
This is in Australia?
Yeah, this was in Australia, yeah. And, I've never been the type of person that, like the person that you described talking to previously who's done LSD, what, it's 75 times at incredibly high doses. That's never, 73 times, sorry. I've never been that. There's a lot of people that do that sort of thing, not necessarily with the care and methodical nature of the person that you previously interviewed, but there's people all over the place that talk about taking 10 strips of LSD and things like that, and so they're probably far better authorities on the high dose LSD experience than I am. Because my thing has never been taking super high doses of psychedelics or even taking them many times. I just kind of like to try something and move on to try something new. So that's what I have to say about LSD. But I'm very interested in the history and the chemistry and the pharmacology.
Yeah, you're still a little off camera. Sorry to be a pain.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
Sorry. Well, now I'm looking.
We should eventually. We should treat your Patreon subscribers to a exclusive Q&A sesh near the end of the talk, if you're cool with that. Someone asks if you could use the ergot culture, or if the sclerotia must be used.
You can use the liquid culture. Yeah, you can.
That's the third drink I've seen you have here, but
yeah. This is the last dregs of a ruby red grapefruit seltzer. I'm just trying to get the last sip that's going on here, but yeah, you can. And for practical purposes, I don't know of anyone. I don't think anyone that has ever successfully cultivated ergot and used it as a source for LSD outside of a sort of pharmaceutical environment. This is not like growing, psilocybin containing mushrooms where someone can just do it, under their bed as a side project. Not to say that you couldn't grow it, you could, but to produce enough that you could, yield, let's say, hundreds of milligrams of lysergic acid after the hydrolysis, I kind of doubt it,
And how were your acid trips, you think?
They were extremely, extremely good.
Someone asked, do you think there's a possible correlation between your dislike of the Grateful Dead and your unfamiliarity with LSD usage?
Maybe. I don't know. Probably not.
What are the odds of just like the whole process you described of LSD? It seems like pretty unlikely that it was made by accident, right? It wasn't meant to be made as psychedelic.
Yeah.
But for the barbiturate research, like you mentioned, are there?
It wasn't for.
Go ahead. Yeah. Well,
it was inspired by a drug that is used to treat barbiturate overdoses.
Yeah, and wasn't ergot also used for like blood clot treatment or something like that?
Yeah, for postpartum hemorrhage.
But how does, chemically speaking, I was just curious, like how does LSD compare to other synthesized psychedelics in terms of the complexity to synthesize it?
In terms of the total, again, when we talk about the synthetic complexity of LSD, you have to talk about it two ways. One involves the total synthesis of lysergic acid, in which case it is incredibly, incredibly complicated. If you're just talking about lysergic acid to LSD, not necessarily very complicated, although I have never done it myself, so I can't say exactly how difficult, but I've made many amides in my life, and they have never been tricky. Then the chromatography is also, I don't predict, especially difficult. It seems pretty straightforward. But you're dealing with something that's very, very potent, and that does change things a little bit. Same thing as if you're working with poisons, or really anything that has the potential to have a pronounced biological effect accidentally. You have to treat all the chemistry with a certain care, and there are many examples of clandestine LSD manufacturers dosing themselves accidentally, and really and not kind of in a little mystical twinkle like Albert Hoffman had on April 16th. This is a incapacitating non-fatal overdose. I heard a story about William Leonard Picard, that he overdosed in one of the labs that I believe was located in Phoenix, Arizona. Don't quote me on that. And I think was out for possibly multiple days. And of course, typically the duration of LSD is between 6 and 12 hours. But with almost any drug, when you really, really overdose, it can change the pharmacokinetics. It can cause more lasting psychological disruptions. It can have all sorts of changes. It can, otherwise inactive metabolites can suddenly become active because they're present in such enormous quantities. So, yeah.
And who are some other people in the LSD movement that you think don't get enough of the limelight?
People in the LSD movement. I mean, I just interviewed this guy that I thought was so interesting. He allowed me to record the interview, and I'll release it on Patreon if he gives me permission to make it public, which he hasn't done yet. I'm waiting on that. But this guy was like, and normally I don't really like to talk to dealers, like either personally or for my film writing projects. Not because I have anything against dealers. I think they are the people behind almost all use of psychedelics. So nothing against them, but I just really like the chemistry and science side of it, and so I often don't interview dealers. But this guy was not an LSD chemist, but a very high-level LSD dealer in the 70s in the so-called Clear Light network, and which was a certain kind of network of LSD producers and distributors. And this guy claims to have been the person that first gave Steve Jobs LSD. He claims to have been Steve Jobs' LSD dealer. And I think that there are a lot of these amazing stories of the people that were risking their freedom to distribute LSD. We, all know the names of, or maybe not all, but many people know the names of Tim Scully and Nick Sand and Owsley and those sorts of people, the chemists. But of course, there were, all sorts of distributors as well who made very important contributions.
Yes. There's a cat in my way a little bit. How about Nick Sands? What's the scoop on Nick Sands, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, Nick Sand, he's the subject of a cool movie that's made by an acquaintance of mine, Cosmo Fielding Mellon, The Sunshine Makers. It's definitely worth watching for anyone that hasn't already seen it. It features really great interviews with both Tim Scully and Nick Sand. And Nick Sand, it was someone that I was going to interview for the DMT episode of my show. I talked to him days before he died. I'd been trying to interview him for a really long time, and I was hoping to talk with him about the meat and potatoes of the synthesis, which is what I was most interested in. But he didn't really want to talk about that. He had an accomplice who was really the person, and I'm not talking about Tim Scully. He had a different accomplice whose name is known publicly but is not widely known. And I guess I'm just not going to say his name, although maybe I'm just not going to say his name. It's publicly known. Anyway, he had another accomplice who's really like the kind of nerdy person behind a lot of the syntheses, and I was eventually able to talk with that person and learned quite a bit. There's still a lot more that I would love to know. And yeah, these were kind of people who considered themselves on a holy mission to change the world.
The brotherhood of eternal love.
Yeah.
Someone asked, quick tangent, if you could tell the story of the one-handed man on methamphetamine who chased you and Steve Gill in an airport.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell that story. It's kind of a sad story. I don't. How do I say? I don't want to say. I don't want to tell the story. I don't want to make anyone feel bad, but I could tell it. I certainly can tell the story.
If you're don't worry about it. If you'd rather not.
Well, cool. Okay. I mean, this is in Steve Gill's. I don't want to say anything mean. This is. I'll tell you in Steve Gill's own words. Like, there's a term. For like a prison, like a boyfriend that your girlfriend or your wife will get while you're in prison. It's like called a Sancho. That's the term. So like his wife's Sancho was like this meth man who only had one hand. And oh man, this is a really long story. I actually have a recording of the entire thing somewhere. I need to dig it up.
Well, you could. If you want to give a synopsis, or you could upload it to your Patreon.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't even know if I want to listen to it myself. But anyway, okay. There was a big argument, and this guy with one hand who was really, really high on meth started attacking us, like throwing really heavy metal tools at us, and so we had to run into the woods, and we tried to break into his shuttered former clandestine MDMA lab. But then he had a rock, and he was trying to break open the lock, but he couldn't break it open. We were hiding behind the lab, and then we like ran through the woods some more and made it back into the car, and were able to get away from this guy who was trying to kill us. And then Steve, this was the first time, or maybe the second time that I'd met Steve Gill, and I was staying in San Francisco at the time, and this was way, way up north, like almost near the Oregon border. And I was like, all right, that was like really unexpected. Can you take me home now? And he was like, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to Oregon. Like, I can't take you back. I'm going to leave you at like an airstrip, and like you'll be able to find a plane home. And I couldn't even believe that he was doing that to me. It was like, it was one of those things that's so crazy when someone does something like that to you that you can't even get angry at them, because it just communicates that they're completely deranged, and there's no reason. So, and he was in a bad place then. Like, he was really seriously addicted to methoxetamine as well. So that was a dark, strange time for him, and it was a strange experience for me. And I didn't tell the entire story, but I think you probably get it now.
Thanks for sharing. Do you want to go to some? Is there anything else about acid that you think you should share that maybe is an interesting cultural or scientific aspect about it that's lesser known, and then we can go and do some Q&A?
Something I should share about LSD that is lesser known. No, let's just do the Q&A.
All right. I do have one more question. You kind of answered this in the beginning, but people colloquially usually say what?
Well, I would just maybe say one thing, which is that, and this is something that I'm not certain about, but I have a suspicion is the case. There's this idea that Timothy Leary destroyed psychedelic research, which is widely disseminated in the psychedelic community, and was definitely the attitude that was promoted in the Michael Pollan book from, I guess now probably 2 years ago. And I think it's really important to note that I think that the discontinuation of Sandoz production of LSD occurred in 1963, like well before Leary or Alpert or any of those people were household names. I don't think they really became household names until the 70s. So I just think that is one thing that we should really be aware of, that I think that, if anything resulted in the prohibition, it was maybe pulling the plug on pharmaceutical development of LSD. That was the kiss of death. Once it became clear that there was no way that this was going to survive in a sort of capitalist medical establishment, then it became very easy to criminalize it. And I think blaming Leary is a kind of misguided exercise in finger pointing.
Cool. That is a lesser heard perspective. Thanks for sharing. Do you want to do some questions from your Patreon subscribers. I got to open here if you'd like me to ask you them. Feed you the cues.
Okay, here we go. Is there anything about morning glory plants in the new season? So I am doing an LSD episode in the new season. I have not finished filming it. So that is, and it's missing some really kind of crucial material, but I did interview this biochemist named Daniel Panaccione, who is an expert on the synthesis of lysergamides by different species of fungi. And yeah, we talked about production in morning glories. We talked about production in different Aspergillus species. We talked really about how widely distributed these lysergamides, or the genes for the production of lysergamides, are in nature. And it really is, they're quite a bit more common than you would think. You know, like there's Metarhizium species. There's all kinds of different fungi that produce lysergamides. It's not just, you know, fungi in the genus Claviceps. Is there anything to expand on ketamine? No, I'm not going to do a piece about ketamine. Can you go into a difference between LSD and its analogs, like 1P and 1-cyclopropyl? Yeah, okay, so that's the other thing. It's probably worth mentioning, is that, you know, now there's been this proliferation of gray market novel lysergamides, 1P LSD, which is a sort of ALD 52 derivative, where instead of having an acetyl group on the indole nitrogen, it has a propionyl group, and that can hypothetically be extended forever, and they act as LSD prodrugs, at least the ones that have the amide substituent in the indole 1 position. So 1P LSD is the most widely distributed one of these. There's a great paper written by a friend of mine, Jason Wallach, where he talks about it being converted to LSD. And so once it's converted to LSD, it's an LSD prodrug. The same is not true of the novel lysergamides that incorporate a different substituent on the basic nitrogen. So that would be things like Al-Lad, Pro-Lad, Parg-Lad, Eth-Lad, and so on and so forth. Those do have pharmacological differences, and you know, if you want to read about those differences, they're detailed in TCAL, and they're also described on, you know, countless forums like Reddit and Blue Light, and you can, you know, read lots of people's experiences with those things. Then the third point of modification on the LSD molecule would be the amide nitrogen, and so you have a lot of room for variation there. Most of these modifications reduce potency, but you can have, you know, the methyl isopropyl, you can have the diethyl, you can have the dipropyl, you can have the morpholine ring that was being distributed for a while. That's way down in potency. I think that takes you, you know, it's something like a milligram for an active dose, or maybe 500 micrograms or something, way down. And, you know, you have azetidine rings, various substituents on that, and then there's interesting stereochemistry there that's been examined by David Nichols. You have, and then you also have things like the dihydro LSD, which has also been synthesized. That's never been made available on the gray market. So there's a bunch of these novel lysergamides. It's really exciting. I have no experience with them, I'm sorry to say. I find them all very fascinating. I worked a little bit with Jason Wallach on one of his publications, and, you know, we did some analysis work on them. So, you know, I've like worked with them in that sense, but I haven't tried any of them.
What's the one that's not in the gray market that you mentioned?
The dihydro derivatives. Yeah, like dihydro LSD, which could be made from hydrogen, hypothetically. All right, okay. What else on Patreon? What are your thoughts on the misuse of LSD by the American government in projects like MK Ultra and Project Artichoke? Do you think the government banned LSD and other drugs because of how much this torture affected the victims of these projects? Well, if the point were to torture them, you'd think that they would be happy about how they were affected. But no, I don't think. I don't think that is the reason. I think that no one really knows all of the social political forces that were at play in the prohibition of LSD and other psychedelics, and maybe there's a bit of that their lack of use as weapons made them even less attractive. But they could have been illegal and still used them as weapons, right? Like BZ is a controlled substance. BZ is a very interesting instance of a controlled substance that has no history of abuse, if you want to call it that, of unsanctioned use, and it could presumably still be used as a chemical weapon, right? So that I don't think is a good reason. No. And what do I think about the LSD doing experiments on about the government doing experiments on people with LSD? I think that it's profoundly unethical to give anyone a psychedelic without their knowing. It can and does have severely negative consequences, and like what I think is obvious is that everyone was very impressed by the potency of these compounds. Like, can you imagine the discovery of LSD and how exciting that would be? There had never been anything like that. Just in terms of its potency, it's extraordinary. I mean, people talk about 100 micrograms being, a standard dose. I don't think they realize that LSD freebase exerts threshold activity at under 10 micrograms. This is a fantastically potent substance, period. In terms of any type of activity, it's incredibly potent. And then to, on top of its pure potency, also be something that exerts such a dramatic, extraordinary effect on human consciousness. I mean, it's very exciting, and it's not surprising that they wanted to exploit those effects in some kind of way. It's just unfortunate that it happened to be nefarious.
What does freebasing LSD look like, or how would you do that?
So freebase is used as a verb often, meaning like to smoke, usually the base of something, the freebase. But so you could freebase LSD, but when I'm talking about freebase LSD, I'm not talking about the verb, the act of smoking it. I'm talking about the LSD molecule where the basic nitrogen is not engaged in an ionic bond with an acid counterion.
Someone here's asking if you can talk about the problems associated with 5-HT2B agonism, and do you believe this can cause problem for LSD or psilocybin users?
Yeah, I do. I think it could cause a problem. I don't think that, there was a sort of suspect study that came out of some Pomeranian researcher from Pomerania. And he did this study where he showed long-term low-dose use of psilocybin or psilocin causes presumably 5-HT2B mediated valvulopathies, and this is not entirely surprising because it's been seen time and time again that drugs that act as 5-HT2B agonists cause a thickening of the heart valves that can be fatal. And so one of the big questions in psychedelic research is, how do we eliminate 5-HT2B agonism from these drugs? And is the existing 5-HT2B agonism that is present in drugs like psilocin and LSD, is it a problem for that average user? I would say it seemed to be, right? There are plenty of people that have used LSD hundreds and hundreds of times that are not, and they're not dropping dead like flies because of thickening of their heart valves, but I wouldn't want to push it, and that's the case with many, many things. There's a lot of drugs that are safe to use occasionally, and then once you make them a really common substance you use at high doses, they begin to exert a different constellation of toxic effects. So I guess the short answer is I don't know. There was a study that I believe was not published that was funded by Compass Pathways that I believe, I haven't seen the actual text of this, I just have heard from someone that was involved that it found that there was not a cardiotoxic effect from psilocybin in this new protocol, which is presumably done under more rigorous circumstances than the past Pomeranian article that I was describing. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Someone's asking about your interview with Jonathan Ott, and if he's still based out of Mexico and what he's doing with his research.
Yeah, I interviewed Jonathan Ott last year. I had a lot of difficulty contacting him and a lot of difficulty interviewing him. He is, yes, still based in Mexico, and I don't think that he's doing research at the moment. I'm not sure about that. If anyone's friends with him can help facilitate another connection with him, I'd love to find him again. He's a very elusive person. I mean, he doesn't even talk at these conferences typically. I think he doesn't even like to speak in English usually. He's a very strange guy.
It's the name Thomas. Oh, if you want to ask, what does the name Thomas Morton mean to you? Anything?
Thomas Morton is my friend and former roommate. He lived in my apartment.
Asked what it was like to share an apartment with him.
I thought it was really funny. I thought he was the best roommate I've ever had. I really liked him a lot. We're still close friends. We lived together for quite a while. He got divorced and needed a place to stay, and I let him move into my apartment for a while. And it was fun. It was a fun period. He was going through a difficult stretch, but it was a good time.
You're welcome, Melissa. How about 2CG? Have you ever tried that?
2CG?
Yeah.
Oh man, I wonder if this is the same 2CG fanatic who was like hysterically posting during the last live stream. There was like some guy that just kept posting like hundreds of times stuff about Ganesha, which is not 2CG. It's the amphetamine derivative of 2CG. I've never tried 2CG. The reason that there isn't more information about 2CG and 2CG derivatives is that the synthesis is pretty challenging. It's just not easy to make. I think that the 3,4 disubstituted phenethylamines are insanely interesting, and that's not just the alkyl substituents in the 3 and 4 position. Think about for a minute what happens if you have 2 electron withdrawing substituents. It could be really synthetically, again, very challenging, but I think possible, and I think that could open up a whole new world of really interesting phenethylamines. And the fact that they're synthetically challenging is the reason that no one's really done it yet. But for any enterprising young chemist, it's a very interesting project. I do hope one day to investigate some of those myself. And 2CG, I've never tried it. I think I already said that, but very few people have tried 2CG. Pretty much everything that is known about 2CG and Ganesha can be found in P-Call by Alexander Shulgin.
Someone asks if you know of any indigenous cultures that have adopted LSD into their shamanic or medicinal practices?
No, I don't. I think it's a really interesting idea. When I first started filming Pharmacopeia, there was a producer that I worked with named Santiago Stelli, and he was very, very interested in the idea of giving LSD to indigenous people. And he even wanted to, do a series about, going to unusual parts of the world and giving people who had never had a psychedelic experience LSD. I think it's a really interesting idea. There's kind of, I think there's a lot of reasons you could think up not to do that, outside of the obvious legal problems with, going around giving people LSD. There's a question of, disrupting the culture as an outsider and introducing something that could interfere with their traditions in one way or another. But short answer is no, I'm not aware of it. And there is part of me, for example, when I was in West Africa, I was, with this, this winter, I was in West Africa twice. And when I was in Gabon, I was staying with this really wonderful Bwiti Iboga church. And, they were so generous with everything, with sharing their customs and their knowledge. And there was part of me that thought, it would be wonderful to give them LSD and see how they would integrate it into their practices. There's even an interesting little aside in the Psychoactive Plant Encyclopedia by Christian Ratch, where he talks about the combination of LSD and ibogaine being an especially interesting one, because it allows you to use less ibogaine, and you can use LSD to kind of get the best out of both substances, which is especially nice because iboga is an endangered plant. And so if you could, supplement the iboga with something that's more available and sustainable, like LSD. It could have a lot of benefits, but again, I didn't do it because I just,
I feel like there might be some ethical issues with that.
I think there are. And even if there aren't, people would find them. People would figure out a way to get extremely angry and offended by it. And it's not even important. Like, they have a beautiful tradition on their own. They don't need me giving them LSD. And then on top of that, again, this all comes back to this really unfortunate fact that the two psychedelics that normal people have access to, psilocybin-containing mushrooms and LSD, are two psychedelics where people can't know the dose. Right? You can weigh mushrooms on a scale, on the most accurate scale in the world, but you don't know how much psilocin or psilocybin or baeocystin you're consuming, so it's still kind of an unknown. And with LSD, you can pretend all day that every hit that you consume is 100 micrograms, but you have no idea unless you are, working with pure crystal and diluting it yourself, and you know the exact stereochemistry and salt and purity and all of that. So, I also wouldn't, in addition to just all the problems and issues with giving another human being a psychedelic at all, giving them a psychedelic that you don't know what dose it is something that would make me even more uncomfortable. So, but this wasn't a question about me giving other people psychedelics. It was just a question about, which I wouldn't do, but it's just a question about, whether indigenous groups ever integrate LSD into their practices. And yeah, the short answer is not that I'm aware of.
What does family acid mean when that comes up? People describe that.
Like,
does that mean anything to you?
I mean, there are all these, clear light, brotherhood, rainbow gathering, rainbow family. I don't really understand what. I think a lot of these things become kind of like marketing terms that don't actually mean anything. But for some people, they do, and in some groups, they do. So, again, yeah, I don't really know. It denotes some, what is that, rainbow family or something?
Have you heard of like the fingerprint tests that people sometimes have to do in order to be able to cut it? Yeah. Do you think that's true?
I think it is true. Yeah, I've read pretty convincing reports of it. It seems. Well, we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
And this is something that I would just. It seems like a really odd thing to do, to request another person take this absurdly high dose of a psychedelic, because what does that even say?
I think it's like a trust. I think it's pretty obvious to me. It's like a trust thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm not speaking as an anthropologist here, but I think it's kind of analogous to in Native American traditions when they pass the altar down in generations. It's kind of seen as like an initiation that unless you have the maturity to carry it and the kind of character, they're not going to just give it to anybody. And from what I've heard, the thumbprint tests are a way to make sure they are able to do that. It's kind of like a rite of passage.
Yeah. Cool. I get it. But yeah. I also, a certain part of me thinks, well, why would you, there's all sorts of bad people that have used very high doses of LSD. I don't think that just because someone consumes a really high dose of LSD, that means that they're inherently trustworthy. And I think just because someone doesn't want to subject themselves to an extremely high, unmeasured dose of LSD means that they're untrustworthy. It seems like just kind of an odd way of I suppose really, there's the term like trial by ordeal. And,
like initiation, right? Even in like the games or something, getting beaten up or having to do something heinous.
Okay, so I'm going to answer a couple Patreon questions. Someone says, does freebase LSD have the same length of activity? Yes, it does. It's just slightly more potent by weight. Then someone else says, have you ever seen San Pedro flower? Absolutely, I have. It's very beautiful. Okay. How do you feel about the proliferation of negative stories? There's still, What is your favorite? Oh, someone said, what is your favorite culturally historic LSD moment? I don't know that I have one, but one thing, just random thing that I'll bring up is I'm very, very obsessed with Stanley Kubrick, and Stanley Kubrick was vocally opposed to LSD. He thought that it was, artistically bad to consume LSD, and then Michael Pollan in his book said that Stanley Kubrick had used LSD, and I thought, isn't that unusual? Because anyone that knows anything about Stanley Kubrick knows that he was a control freak, that he was extremely phobic, that he lived his life really in fear of anything short of total control of everything around him. He was going to move to Australia, and I think had all of his money transferred to an Australian bank, had all of his possessions shipped to Australia because he was so afraid of the UK being struck by an atomic bomb. But then he wouldn't get in a plane because he thought planes were too dangerous, so he decided to go on a boat. But then when he realized that on a boat he'd have to share a bathroom with other people, he decided that he would just stay in the UK. So he was like extremely afraid of everything. And the idea of someone like that, relinquishing control to use a psychedelic strikes me as very odd. And I had the opportunity to speak with Andrew Birkin, who, for those of you aren't familiar with him, he's Jane Birkin's brother. Jane Birkin was Serge Gainsbourg's lover, and collaborated with him musically, and they made some great songs together. Anyway, and she's also in the movie Blow Up. And so Andrew Birkin worked with Kubrick on 2001 and was tasked with poaching the endangered South African aloe trees that are used in the Dawn of Man sequence. And so I was talking, and he poached these endangered trees, and then they didn't even use them in the Dawn of Man sequence. They just made fake ones. Anyway, so I was talking with Andrew Birkin, and I asked him, there's like this kind of debate about whether or not Stanley Kubrick ever used LSD. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I also find these sorts of things, like, in some sense, it doesn't matter whether Kubrick used LSD. So I'm not going to suggest, like, either. I would find it very obnoxious if someone were to suggest that his creative genius were derived from LSD use or anything like that. So that's one I should say before even getting into this, that it, in some sense, doesn't matter at all. But I'm still curious. And so I asked him, and he said he didn't know with certainty, but that he would be extremely, extremely surprised that everything about his knowledge of Kubrick and his personal interactions with him made him think that it would be totally impossible. So as of the production of 2001, doesn't seem like Kubrick had used LSD, and I don't think he ever did. That's not an answer to the question at all.
Well, it was one of your favorite cultural LSD snippets.
Well, because 2001 is sort of like a quintessential trip movie. It was a movie that was actually critically and in terms of box office success, it was sort of a flop when it first came out. And it wasn't until it was discovered by the counterculture as like an awesome movie to see when you're stoned that 2001 became a huge success. So this is a movie that was really saved by its trippiness. I think they even, as a tagline, they started calling it the ultimate trip or something like that. So it was like, so it's not totally, surprising, especially with the Stargate sequence, to assume that he was, interested in the aesthetics of psychedelia. So another question: how do you feel about? And we should probably we're going to wrap this up sometime soon. I imagine
10 or so.
I'm starting to lose my voice. All this quarantine, I don't talk in quarantine. I'm just silent.
We've been talking a little bit.
Yeah, I guess we chatted a little bit, but okay. So someone said, "What do you think of the NBOME compounds?" So for anyone that doesn't know, one of the interesting things about LSD and it being so potent is that it allowed it to be distributed in ways that are inaccessible for less potent substances, namely dropping it onto small squares of blotter paper and distributing it that way. And because a small square of paper can only accommodate at most a few milligrams, it really limits the number of different substances that could be distributed that way. For example, you could never distribute mescaline on a blotter, or it would require a very large blotter to do that. So that was one of the things that made it a little bit more difficult to misrepresent LSD. But then sometime around, let's say 2012, maybe plus minus 2 years, these N-benzylphenethylamines became very popular and accessible on the gray market, and they were misrepresented as LSD because they were potent enough that they could be laid on blotters. And they also had, although many people will disagree with me when I say this, they had subjective effects that were somewhat similar to LSD as well. And many more people will disagree with me when I say this. I think they are actually fantastic substances. I think that people got so wrapped up in hating them because they were misrepresented as LSD that they decided that the substances themselves were somehow bad. And that's not the case. They're beautiful substances, synthetically, chemically, pharmacologically, and qualitatively. They're very, very interesting. And, they're easier to produce. They're extraordinarily potent, very beautiful, historically beautiful. I mean, the whole thing about that, I just think they're amazing no matter how you cut it. And everyone talks about these things. I've heard people in the psychedelic community say, I don't believe in prohibition, but they should make 2,5-B and BOME illegal because that stuff is poison. And it's horrible. It makes me cringe when I hear that sort of thing because first of all, every time you prohibit a substance, you make it inaccessible to scientific researchers, and you might think, well, who cares about 2,5-B NBOME or 2,5-CN NBOME? Well, there's a lab that recently was able to elucidate the structure of the 5-HT2A receptor, the agonist-bound 5-HT2A receptor, and what was the ligand that they used to do it? It was 2,5-CN NBOME. So some random N-benzylphenethylamine turned out to be behind what could be one of the most important discoveries in serotonin receptor research. I heard actually yesterday that there may have been some problems with that crystal structure, or with that cryo-EM data. So let's maybe hold off on celebrating. But anyway,
it's common, guys.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so it's unfortunate. Misrepresentation of any kind is totally unfortunate and should be discouraged, but I think that it's totally unfair to these N-benzylphenethylamines that are never hurt anyone. It's not their fault that some schmuck sold them as LSD. And, I think it's unfortunate that people dismiss them as a class because I think they're really interesting compounds with a lot of nice attributes.
Someone asks, and maybe do one or two more questions, and we can call it a night. Thank you, by the way, for joining us, Hamilton. They ask, Hamilton, would you keep the 2 or 5 MEO or another electron donating substituents? Don't you need them for binding? For example, findings from fly conformationally constrained analogs.
The 2 or 5 MEO is what he said? On what molecule?
Let's see if Trey. Let's see here. I just had the question up. Doesn't say what molecule. Would you keep the 2 or the 5 MEO or another electron donating substituents?
It just depends on what he's or she is referring to.
On phenethylamine.
The 2, would I keep the 2 or the 5? I'm sorry, I'm talking to you like you're asking this question. Would I keep it, Colin? Would I keep the 2 or the 5 in one?
They're saying you talked about 3 to 4 electron withdrawing.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Trey. I'm not sure of your question.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. They're saying would I maintain the 2,5-dimethoxy substitution pattern? Yeah. Why not? Because you don't want to just change it. Come on. Here we're talking about
guys.
We're talking about exploring the structure-activity relationship. You want to do it one substituent at a time. You don't just change every part of the molecule simultaneously and see what happens. And it seems that that the 2,5-dimethoxy substitution pattern is pretty much optimal. Maybe 5-ethoxy has superior pharmacokinetics or something like that. But and I'm not getting in. And obviously, once you start going into the benzodifuran or type situations, things become a little bit more complicated. But in terms of just basic phenethylamine structure activity relationships, the 2,5 seems to be fine. And that's, yeah. So if I were hypothetically exploring interesting 3,4 disubstituted phenethylamines, I would just keep the 2,5 intact, because why not?
There you go, Trey. Someone's kept asking, and I feel like it's a pretty basic question that should get answered, is what your favorite psychedelic is, Hamilton.
All these kinds of favorite, craziest, all these superlatives. It's just I don't have one.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
What's your least favorite psychedelic?
What's
favorite? The most boring psychedelic you can think of?
Most boring psychedelic I can think of. I don't know. I mean, everything, even the inactive things, are interesting in their own way. Everything's interesting.
Someone says, what's the most fascinating chemical compound?
Oh my God, all this most. Like, here's a piece of advice to everyone.
Guys, you're getting more advice, email advice?
Yeah, I'm just going to give you some advice. Like, I get all these, like, superlative questions. It's not a good way to interact with someone, because it's no one like has an honest answer to those questions. Like, what's the craziest day of your life? Like, if you were to say that to me, I could, like, spend some time and come up with a story, but it wouldn't be an honest answer. It would be a story that I concocted to respond to the question, what is the craziest day of your life?
What's the craziest superlative request you've gotten?
Oh,
I'm just kidding. Oh, well, that would let me think for a second.
That might have been it.
Did you ever get to meet Alexander Shulgin again anytime after your interview with him? If so, how was it?
Yeah, I met him many times before and after that interview. I think that it was sort of framed as if it were an isolated meeting. But I went to Shulgin's home on the 4th of July for maybe 5 years in a row, starting in 2007, and really for every remaining year of his life. And even after, and I was lucky enough to meet him and spend time with him on, probably 10 occasions, something like that. And it was great. It was great. When I interviewed him, it was really toward the end of his life, and he was having a lot of cognitive difficulties, and it wasn't easy. And if it had been anyone else, I probably wouldn't have wanted to do it at all. But because he was such an extraordinary genius, even him in a kind of somewhat reduced state was still totally inspiring for me. And yeah, I wish I'd gotten the opportunity to know him when he was younger, but maybe when he was younger, he was more private and wouldn't have wanted to talk to someone like me. I don't know. I don't know. It happened when it happened. It happened to be the end of his life. But I did have that opportunity to talk with him and meet him on quite a few occasions and talk about chemistry and spend time in his lab. And, to this day, just looking at a photo of him gives me chills, because I truly love that man and think that he is just such an extraordinary figure, and his contributions were so wonderful. So, yeah.
I feel like doing this as a public service thing. A teenager apparently wrote us politely asking, they're an avid weed user for about a year and a half. They've had psychosis after some mental health issues, but they're better now and heading to college soon. Am I at high risk of psychosis using psychedelics? I would say yes, as Colin. Definitely be careful if you've had those things, and see if you have a family history of bipolar or schizophrenia. But Hamilton, do you have any advice?
Well, you've had some difficulties, right?
Thanks, Hamilton. Yeah, cool.
Okay, we all, but specifically with psychedelics, right? I mean, it's not uncommon. It's somewhat uncommon, but people. I don't know if that's you. Do you not want to talk about it?
I could be on your Patreon if you guys were dying to hear. I have had kind of manic, it felt like spiritual experiences, but would psychiatrically be described as mania that LSD was involved in. Yeah, but thanks for putting me on the spot with that one.
Oh, well, and I'll say this, I have on one side of my family, there's quite a bit of mental illness, and I had the extraordinary and somewhat traumatizing experience of watching my best friend at the time have a psychotic break while under the influence of a psilocin ester, and after watching that happen, I had the feeling that anytime I used a psychedelic, I was rolling the dice with my consciousness, and it was really only a matter of time before I lost my mind. And that in and of itself doesn't promote an enjoyable experience if you're going into it with a lot of fear. So if you're at a time in your life going into school, you're already going to be extremely stressed, and maybe you're already vulnerable. I would maybe just try to go easy on yourself and be a little bit cautious, and then maybe when you're in a more stable phase of your life, you could reconsider those sorts of things. But going into college as a freshman is already incredibly stressful, and it can cause psychosis by itself. So I would take these things one step at a time.
I would like to associate myself with Hamilton's suggestions. I didn't myself even try psychedelics until I was basically done with college. I also had a careful approach to them, and the times that I did have it was drug-induced mania. It wasn't from bipolar. It was in a time in my life when I was very depressed and stressed out. I learned a lot from that experience, but I would caution against using psychedelics when you're under acute depression or having acute life shifts. All right, Hamilton. Is there anything else you'd like to...
No, I think I answered all the Patreon
Actually,
questions.
one question I think we haven't answered. I know the answer to this, but I've seen it on Patreon, I've seen it on mine, is when is Hamilton's Pharmacopeia Season 3 going to be released?
I mean, you may have heard about this pandemic situation.
What is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not wide. So I have no idea. At one point I would have said, the summer, June, July, something like that. My guess is not anymore. Things are going to be slowed down. Exactly how quickly they ramp back up depends on how the cash flow is impacted by this and what sorts of changes have to be made. As far as release dates, I don't really care as long as it's good. I just want it to be good. And what really frightens me about this isn't that it's going to come out later. That's fine. People can wait. But I really hope that something doesn't happen where, edit days are cut, or, for example, I have heard that there's going to be basically no promotion for the show. That money will have evaporated. So
well, maybe we can help with that.
Maybe, but so that's what I release date. Who knows? I kindly and lovingly request that you do not contact me to ask, because I don't know. But let's just hope that when everything is done, that it's all done very well. That's what's most important.
Would you ever have an interest in doing a remote chemistry class with the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. You heard it here first, guys. Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us. Your stories and insights and perspicuity with the chemical nature of these fine friends of ours is awesome.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a safe bicycle day, and we'll see you guys later.
See ya.
Bye.